Cora Delaney walked out of her marriage on a Saturday morning in May with the specific kind of calm that came not from peace, but from the exhaustion of a person who had been preparing to leave for longer than they had been willing to admit, and whose preparations had finally aligned with their courage. Her husband's name was Philip. He was 53 years old and had spent the 26 years of their marriage building, dismantling, and rebuilding the financial structure of their shared life with a facility that she had initially mistaken for competence and had come to understand was something else. A particular kind of intelligence applied not to building something for both of them, but to building something in which she was structurally dependent and he was structurally in control. She was 50 years old. She had a degree in landscape architecture that she had not used professionally in 22 years, having stepped back from her career at 28 when Philip's consulting work had required relocation, and the relocation had required one of them to manage the household and the children and the complicated logistics of a life built around his schedule. She had managed those things with the competence of someone who was genuinely good at them and who had found over time that being good at things did not make those things into a career or a financial foundation or any form of security that was hers rather than borrowed from a marriage she had not yet understood she was depending on completely. The children were grown. Her daughter Meg was 24 and lived in Boston. Her son Patrick was 22 and was finishing a graduate program in Portland. They had been launched into their own lives before the marriage had ended, and the launching had taken the last context in which she and Philip had needed to function as a unit rather than as the two separate people they had apparently been for considerably longer than she had understood. The house on Meridian Drive was Philip's, having been purchased in his name during one of the financial reorganizations that had happened during the marriage and that she had signed paperwork for, without the specific comprehension that the paperwork deserved. The investment accounts were Philip's, having been structured in the way of investment accounts belonging to someone whose name appeared consistently on the relevant documents. The joint account had a balance that reflected the most recent month's activity, and not the decades of household income that had flowed through it and out of it, according to Philip's management. She had a car. She had her personal belongings, which filled the back of the car and the trunk, and left the passenger seat clear for the drive. She had the settlement amount that Philip's lawyer and her lawyer had negotiated across 8 months of a process that had felt, in retrospect, like the final demonstration of the dynamic she was leaving, with Philip organized and prepared, and in possession of professionally structured documentation, and her lawyer doing what was possible within a framework that Philip had spent 26 years designing. The settlement was not nothing. Her lawyer had made sure of that, with the focused professionalism of someone who understood they were working against a prepared position, and who had found what they could find within it. The settlement was also not 26 years. There was a gap between what 26 years of shared life warranted and what the legal process had produced, and the gap had a specific number attached to it that she chose not to think about in those terms, because the number in those terms was a form of thinking that was not useful to the situation she was now in. The situation she was now in was the situation of a 50-year-old woman with a car and a settlement and a landscape architecture degree she had not used in 22 years, and nowhere to go. Nowhere, except one place. Her grandmother's name had been Iris Delaney. She had died 4 years ago at the age of 88, with the specific quality of ending that very old people who had been fully themselves until near the end had, which was the quality of a completion rather than a reduction. Iris had owned a lake house. Not a grand lake house. A house on a lake, which was a different category. A 3-bedroom timber frame structure on Lake Harmon in the northern part of the state, on a half-acre lot with a dock that extended 30 feet into the water, and a boathouse that held a canoe Cora had paddled since she was 9 years old, and that was almost certainly still there because the things in the boathouse at the lake house had always been the things in the boathouse at the lake house. The lake house had been in Cora's family since her grandfather Roy had built it in 1958 with his brother and 2 friends over the course of 3 summers, the building being a project of the kind that people undertook in that era, with the understanding that the labor was the contribution and the materials were the cost, and the result was something that belonged to the people who had built it in a way that purchased things did not. Roy had died in 1991, and the house had been Iris's since then, which meant it had been Iris's for 27 years before she died, and had passed to Cora under the specific terms of a will that had been drafted by Iris's lawyer 12 years before her death, with the specific intention that the lake house would go to Cora and not into the estate generally. Iris had told her, not as a piece of financial information, as a conversation, the kind of conversation her grandmother had with her that had the quality of things said clearly between people who trusted each other completely. She had said that the lake house was going to Cora specifically because Cora was the one who understood it, which was Iris's way of saying what Iris meant, that Cora was the one for whom the lake house was what a lake house could be for a person, a place that was not about what it cost or what it was worth, but about what it meant to be in it. Philip had known about the lake house. He had been to it on 5 or 6 occasions over the years, and had found it pleasant in the abstract way he found most things pleasant that were not relevant to the structures he was building. He had not tried to include it in the marital asset negotiation, because the will's specificity and the timing of the inheritance, which had occurred after they had both consulted lawyers, and the trajectory of the marriage was already clear, made the inclusion impractical. The lake house was in her name. It had always been in her name. She drove north. The drive to Lake Harmon was 4.5 hours, which she had driven many times, and which had a specific quality of accumulating peacefulness as the hours passed, and the landscape changed from the suburban geography she was leaving to the lake country of the northern part of the state. The road narrowing, and the trees thickening, and the light becoming the specific light of a region with more water and more sky than the places she had been living. She arrived in the late afternoon, when the lake was the color that lakes in that region were, in the late afternoon of a clear May day, which was the color of something that was not quite blue, and not quite gray, and not quite green, but was all of those things in a proportion that changed as the light changed. She turned into the driveway. The lake house was exactly as she remembered it from the previous summer, when she had come for a week alone. The week she had told Philip she was visiting Meg, and had in fact come here to think. The timber exterior and its faded stain, the covered porch facing the lake, the dock extending into the water, with the specific geometry of a dock built by hand in 1958 that had been repaired over the decades, but never replaced. She sat in the car for a moment. She had left a marriage. She had a car, and a settlement, and a landscape architecture degree. She had a lake house on half an acre with a dock and a boathouse and a canoe. She got out. She unlocked the front door with the key that had been on her keyring since Iris had died 4 years ago, and that she had never removed because removing it would have required a reason, and the reason had never been sufficient. Inside the lake house was the lake house, the specific smell of it, old timber, and the particular mineral quality of lake air, the smell of a place that had been itself for 65 years, and had settled into itself the way places did when they were allowed to be what they were for long enough. The furniture was the furniture of 3 generations of a family's lake use, nothing matching and everything appropriate. The couch that had been there since at least the 1970s, and the table that Roy had built in the garage one winter, and that was solid enough to outlast everything else in the room. Her grandmother's things were still here, which she had known because she had not removed them, and the lawyer's process had not required their removal, and there was no one else to remove them. The bookshelves were full of Iris's books. The kitchen had Iris's dishes. The bedroom had the quilt Iris had made in the year she and Roy had been married, which was 1953, and which meant the quilt was 71 years old, and was in the condition of something that had been made to last, and had been treated accordingly. Cora went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. She stood at the kitchen window that looked at the lake, and watched the May light on the water while the kettle heated. She thought about what she had. She had the lake house. She had the settlement. She had the car. She had the degree in landscape architecture that she had not used in 22 years, and that was in a field that had not stopped existing in 22 years, which meant the field was still there, and the question was whether she was. She thought about the week she had come here alone the previous summer, and what she had thought about during that week, which was this, which was the question of what came after the marriage, which she had not been willing to call the end of the marriage at that point, but which had been what she was thinking about. She had thought about the landscape around the lake, not the lake itself, the land around it, the half-acre of her property and the property she could see from the dock, and the relationship between the built things and the natural things in this part of the lake country that had the specific quality of somewhere that had been developing for decades without the benefit of anyone thinking carefully about how the development related to the landscape it was occurring in. She had been a landscape architect before she had been Philip's wife, and Patrick and Meg's mother, and the person who managed the household, and the relocations, and the logistics of a life built around someone else's career. She had been a landscape architect. She made her tea and took it to the porch. She sat in the chair that had been on this porch since before she could remember, a wooden chair with arms that had been repaired twice, and that she knew the specific quality of from 30 years of sitting in it, the way it tilted slightly to the left, and the specific feel of the left armrest under her hand. She looked at the lake and the dock and the boathouse, and the May evening settling over the water. She thought about 22 years, not with bitterness, or not only with bitterness, with the specific quality of assessment that came from standing outside a long period of your life and looking at it whole. 22 years of competence applied to someone else's structure. 22 years of being good at things that had not been hers. 22 years of the lake house being there on her keyring, the key she had never removed. She thought about Iris saying, "You're the one who understands it." She had understood it as something personal, the specific love of a place. She was beginning to think it might have been something professional as well, that her grandmother had understood what Cora had been before the marriage, and had been making a statement about what she believed Cora could be again. She drank her tea. The lake was doing what lakes did in May evenings in the northern part of the state, which was reflecting the sky in a way that made the sky seem twice as present as it actually was. The real sky above, and the reflected sky below, and the water the medium between them. She called Meg that evening. Meg said she was glad Cora had finally done it. Cora said she should have done it sooner. Meg said she had done it when she had done it, and that was when she had done it. Cora said she was at the lake house. Meg was quiet for a moment, and then said of course she was. She said, was there a plan? Cora said there was the beginning of a plan. She said she had been thinking about the landscape work. She said the degree was 22 years old, and the field had changed, and she was going to need to understand what had changed, and what had not changed, and what she would need to do to be current, rather than dated. Meg said she had a friend who worked in a landscape architecture firm in Minneapolis who might be willing to talk to someone who was returning to the field after a gap. Cora said she was not looking for a job, not yet. She said she was looking for a conversation that would tell her where she was starting from. Meg said she would reach out to her friend. She called Patrick after Meg. Patrick said less than Meg, which was his way, but what he said was specific and direct in the way that was also his way. He said he had watched what the last several years had been, and he was glad it was over. He said he thought the lake house was the right place to start. She said she thought so too. He said what was she going to do with it? She said she was not entirely sure yet. She said she had some ideas. He said were the ideas the landscape ones? She said yes. He said he thought that made sense. She said she needed to think about it more. He said she had time to think. She said she had time. She spent the first 2 weeks at the lake house in a mode that was not quite rest and not quite work, but was the specific mode of someone who was returning to themselves after a period of being organized around something else, and who needed the return to happen at its own pace. She walked the property every morning. She walked the half-acre she owned and the shoreline of the lake as far as she could walk, and the roads that connected the lake houses to the main road, and the land that connected each of those things to each other. She looked at the lake country with the eyes she had been trained to use 22 years ago, and that had been doing other things since. The eyes came back faster than she had expected. The way of looking at land that landscape architecture gave you, the understanding of how water and earth and plants and built structures related to each other, and what that relationship produced for the people who lived within it, was not a skill that disappeared in 22 years. It was latent. It came back in the walking. She started a notebook on the third day, not a formal document, a working notebook, the kind she had kept in her 20s when she had been thinking through projects and had needed to put the thinking somewhere external so she could see it clearly. She wrote observations and questions, and the beginning of ideas that were not yet ideas, but were the precursors of ideas. The lake country around Lake Harmon had, she could see from the walking and the looking, a set of problems that were the problems of a region that had been developed over 60 years by people who had made individual decisions without anyone thinking about the whole. The shoreline development was dense in some sections, and absent in others without the density, or the absence, reflecting any understanding of what the shoreline wanted to be. The transition zones between the built properties and the water were managed or unmanaged in ways that reflected individual preference rather than any coherent understanding of how those zones functioned ecologically and aesthetically. The roads were where the roads were because they had been put there before anyone had thought about the relationship between the road and the landscape. These were solvable problems. They were the kind of problems that a landscape architect looked at and understood as solvable in the way that a doctor looked at a treatable condition. She filled 14 pages in the notebook over the first 2 weeks. On the 15th day, she took the notebook to the porch and sat in the chair that tilted slightly left and read what she had written. She called the county planning office the following morning. She asked who the contact was for Lake Country Development consultations. The contact was a woman named Janet Marsh, who had been the Lake District Planning Coordinator for 9 years and who had, in the 9 years, a well-established list of problems that she had not had adequate professional resources to address. Cora made an appointment. She drove to the county planning office with the notebook and the 22-year-old degree and the specific eyes that came back in the walking, and she sat across from Janet Marsh and listened for 40 minutes to the problems the Lake District had been trying to solve, and then talked for 40 minutes about how she understood those problems and what approaches might address them. Janet Marsh looked at her at the end of the conversation. She said she had been trying to find someone with this specific combination of knowledge and experience for 3 years. Cora said she had been doing something else for the past 22 years. Janet said she was here now. Cora said yes. Janet said she would like to propose a consulting arrangement for a specific shoreline assessment project that had been unfunded and unstaffed for 2 years, and that Cora's background made her specifically suited for. Cora said she would like to hear about it. Janet told her about it. The consulting rate was not the rate of a senior landscape architect with 22 years of active practice. It was the rate of someone returning to the field, which was lower, and was also a starting point rather than a permanent condition. She took the project. She drove back to the lake house in the late afternoon with the project brief on the passenger seat and the May Lake outside the windows as she turned into the driveway and the dock extending into the water at the angle it had extended into the water since Roy had built it in 1958. She sat on the porch. She thought about Philip, not with the anger or the grief or the specific exhaustion of the marriage, but with the cooler clarity of distance. The distance of a woman who had put a marriage in the rear view and was facing forward on a road she was choosing for herself. She thought about 26 years of being good at things that had not been hers. She thought about the landscape work, the notebook, the 14 pages. Janet Marsh saying she had been trying to find someone with this combination for 3 years. She thought about Iris giving her the key and saying she was the one who understood it. She thought about the key on her keyring for 4 years, through the end of the marriage and the lawyers and the 8 months of negotiation and the Saturday morning in May and the 4.5-hour drive north. The key had been there. The lake house had been there. Her eyes had been there, latent, waiting for the walking that brought them back. She had been there. She had been there the whole time, underneath the 22 years of being organized around someone else's structure, the way the landscape had always been there underneath the development that had happened to it, without anyone thinking about the whole. The consulting work was a beginning. The beginning was enough. She opened the notebook to a fresh page. She wrote the date at the top. She started writing. Outside, the lake held the evening light in the way it had held evening light for the 65 years since Roy had built the dock and the house and the boathouse where the canoe still sat. She wrote, the lake was still. The evening was hers.